Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Lubarski, Executive Director of the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. Thank you for joining us today for Sports in a Pandemic World. I know the discussion will be very interesting and informative. I wanted to take this time to wish all of you a happy and healthy holiday season and warm wishes for the new year. We are hopeful that we'll be looking at COVID-19 in the rearview mirror very soon. Visit CWHF.org to see our new year in review. Even though 2020 has been tough, with your support, we've been able to accomplish a great deal. And in the meantime, if you enjoy these webinars and feel that the work we're doing is important, please consider a gift to the Hall. No amount is too small, and all donations are very much appreciated. Again, go to CWHF.org to give and to learn more about our mission. Now I leave you in the capable hands of our founding president and host, Geena Clonan. Geena?
Thank you, Sarah. For nearly 3 decades, the Hall has worked to discover and share the stories of women. Our various educational platforms acknowledge the individual and the collective feminine voice. There's no more important time than now to talk and listen. This will be a half-hour intimate, informative chat, followed by 15 minutes of your questions, which we encourage you to submit at any time during the webinar by simply clicking the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many as possible. Our goal is simple, a virtual gathering to talk about today's important issues. We hope this will be a useful source of information while offering up some good takeaways. We're honored today to have as our guest one of the 10 most powerful women in sports named by Fox Sports, with the Sporting News listing her as one of the 100 most influential people in sports. As a former athlete, she participated in 26 national championships in 4 sports and was a 9-time All-American at 4 different positions in softball. She's a member of the National Sports Hall of Fame, the National Softball Hall of Fame, and the Connecticut and Texas Women's Halls of Fame, among others. Recognized as one of the foremost national experts on gender equity in sports, she's president of Sports Management Resources, a consulting firm, and an adjunct professor at our home, Southern Connecticut State University. Please welcome Dr. Donna Lopiano.
Thanks, Geena.
Thank you for joining us. So we know we can't cover this very complex issue in 40 minutes, but we'll get to some of the more important topics. Let's start with the status of youth and amateur sports. The CDC has issued guidelines based on the recognition that by the nature of play, certain sports are more likely to promote exposure to COVID through respiratory droplets. It's a very complex issue. Can you explain the levels of risk, tiers, and even teams as described by the CDC?
Yeah, I should preface everything I say by noting that for those of you who are in Connecticut, you really need to stay on top of your COVID advisories by state and by community. As you know, Connecticut has moved from stage 3 down back to 2.1. Which is a very high risk category. You all know we're in the middle of an explosion of deaths and positive testing. This is a very dangerous time, and we need to start by reminding everyone that youth sports is not an essential activity, that exposure is serious business, and that youth sports, even though we don't see large numbers of positives among youth, it is the door for COVID spread into families, into schools, into high-risk populations, and you cannot underestimate that danger, and you have to just plan for it. And now in response to your question, the CDC has a very simplistic concept of the various risk levels in youth sport. And the lowest risk level, which corresponds to low danger of transmission, is performing skill building drills at home or conditioning at home or in your backyard or with family members who haven't been exposed or have recently been tested. it is your safest place to be. And we've got to be better at that during this very dangerous time. The second level of risk is called increasing risk. And that is any team-based practice. Okay, you get out of your house, you have to take your kids to the local park or wherever they're playing with their team. So any gathering of children is a higher risk than keeping them at home. The third, more risk category is when this team practice, which you can understand how practice activities, you can keep kids apart, you can kick balls long distances, you can throw with players being distant from each other. But in this third level, it's when you start competition. And you can't keep children apart when they're competing against each other. There's physical activity, physical collisions. You're around people all the time, depending on the nature of the sport. So that is more risk. The fourth level is when teams start to travel. And now you're talking about exposure to other teams, other groups, and you have no idea what their exposure levels have been. You don't know how safe they've been. You don't know how careful they've been. And the very last level is when of highest risk is when you cross state lines, or you're actually competing with teams from other geographical areas. You're getting out of your own city for competition or into Massachusetts. We're so close here. A lot of us will go across state lines to do things. So those are the general principles. And the thing to emphasize is stay home. Stay home, and let's start thinking about how we can get in shape with our children. This is a great opportunity for all of us. We're used to Zoom. We can engage in practice with our teammates via a Zoom call. And I think every parent can be a coach leader of practice, especially conditioning activities. You don't have to kick a ball, you don't have to throw a ball, you don't have to endanger yourself in terms of physical injury. But all of us could lead jumping jacks. We can do sit-ups. We can do all the things that we see as an observing parent coaches doing in conditioning drills. Do it, kids love it. Sure, it isn't the same, but the younger the kid, the less they notice. I also think we're all exposed to video sport games. We can play tennis on videos. We can play soccer on videos without risking exposure. And it's calling upon us to be creative. It's calling upon us to do things we've never done before, just like homeschooling is calling upon us to teach our children at home when school is closed. And we can do this. We can do it. And I just can't say anything more than to urge everyone to be safe rather than sorry.
That's so true. And it's interesting what you said, because somewhere in my questions for you today, one of was, should we allow our kids to get more engaged in video games? Because they can have the feeling of team interaction, of competition, and building their confidence. And you have just zeroed in on that. So that's also a very important aspect of things that we can do to mitigate the situation, which is.
And Geena, I observe in my own neighborhood, what's going on. And I love watching my next door neighbor. There's a 3.5, 4-year-old girl who every day comes out and her mother sets up the laptop outdoors, opens the lift of the family car, right? Sets the laptop up, and she participates in an exercise class with all of her friends. And she's doing it outdoors, which is much safer than doing it indoors. She loves it. You and I may think there's some, oh my God, they're horrified at this notion of not really being with their friends. She's happy as a clam. So don't assume that your children can't embrace this new reality. They are better at dealing with change than we are.
Well, that's interesting, because I read a comment recently from the director of the Society of Research for Child Development in DC. And he said, let's be honest, this is not the gravest thing in the world if a child cannot play sports for 6 months. kids will get over it. Don't think of it as a major psychic blow that will scar them for life. And you clearly indicated that. I think,
Geena, one more thing too. Research shows that kids, and I'm talking to parents of children below the age of 10, if a child does not participate in sports by the age of 10, there's a 90% chance they're not going to be participating later on. But participation in sport means, are you going in the backyard with your parents and having a catch? And we know that children whose parents play are more likely to play themselves. So we have to really see ourselves as leaders, that our children are going to do what are going to emulate us. So the extent to that we're outside, we're playing with them, we're having fun, you can really make a tremendous difference in your kids' lives at this point in time.
and Dr. Lopiano, would you agree that one of the reasons behind these sports suspensions is that youth sports risk school closures and threaten the more important in-school learning for our students? Would you agree?
No question. We have, at least in schools, we know that there is adequate sanitation. We know that they're obsessed now with making sure their desktops are clean, their doorknobs are clean, that everybody's got access to sanitization. Think about typical youth sports, right? People are sharing water bottles, they're hugging other kids, trying to get 6, 7, 8-year-olds to stay away from each other is a really big deal. So there's no question it's a more high-risk activity. They do not have the kind of supervision that they do in school, and it's a much riskier proposition.
Let's talk a little bit more on a broader scale outside of the parent-child interaction that you've covered so beautifully, giving us all kinds of tips of how we can mitigate these circumstances. Throughout the country, players, coaches, and parents involved in youth sports are wondering what will happen to, and I don't think most of us realize this, I didn't. What will happen to a multi-billion-dollar industry? Could the changing landscape of the youth sports industry alter futures for thousands of families?
Yes and no. We know we're going to have economic fallout to the pandemic, and travel teams for kids, nonprofit organization programs for kids, whether it's the local Y or your church or Little League Baseball, these are all nonprofit businesses. Nonprofit organizations are businesses, and when they shut down, they don't have income. They're like the local restaurant, whatever. But so many of the businesses depend on volunteers. So you're not talking about completely laid off staffs, especially in youth sports. And I think we can be assured that those individual entrepreneurs who are running these travel team programs, or your local recreation agency, or your local Y, they will be coming back. I worry more about the private businesses, the local Taekwondo club, and whether they've been able to keep their lease, the single owner, small business venue, as opposed to these larger, better resourced organizations.
Yeah, and I even read where, so it's a trickle down effect. There are those individual clubs. There are the hot dog trucks that come to the field. There are all the hotels where people stay, or the hostels, or the money they spend on food, the equipment that they buy, all of this. I mean, it's a huge industry being affected across the entire landscape.
No, you're right, but we're not going to be able to come back economically unless we can get the pandemic under control. And one of the things that has been the most disappointing part of what's happened in the US, besides the refusal of individuals to wear masks, is the fact that we do not have an adequate testing system. We do not have an in-place system of reporting, for contact tracing, for quarantining. That is nobody's strategic plan. We're not able to turn around a test in 60 minutes. This is unacceptable in the United States. We are the most technologically advanced country in the nation, and I'm hopeful that early in the year we're going to get this testing situation straightened out. What I say to parents, and I'm a consultant for schools all the time, is if you haven't thought about testing, if you don't have daily testing available for you, you have elevated your risk by 60 to 90%. Because we know that asymptomatic players and asymptomatic adults can, before we know it, spread this and cause the shutdowns that you're seeing now when they're calling off the college games, when they're calling off the professional games where they've actually put athletes into bubbles and done the best they could to keep people away from each other. This virus knows no boundary. So we have to really respect it, and all of us should be so insistent for our local governments to get testing in place as soon as we possibly can.
That's great. I'd like to move on to collegiate sports, and you just gave us the perfect intro because Dr. Fauci had said that sports shouldn't happen at all without widespread testing. And clearly we don't have enough of that, and clearly it's not reliable. So let's move on to the college level and all the things we're talking about. But before we do, I wanted you to address just one thing regarding high schoolers and the college recruitment process during the pandemic. Considering what's going on, where are those kids? This is a crucial time for them in terms of what sports and teams they're going to get on for the college. What do you think?
It's okay. It's okay for coaches to recruit by Zoom.
Okay.
It is a waste of money. If you really understood college sports, for instance, to spend money on charter planes for coaches to go watch kids whose games are now available on streaming video every Friday night in football, for us to anachronistically be tied to these old ways of recruiting when we didn't have this capacity, to waste money on this is beyond me. So we can see kids play, we can communicate with them. I believe that there should be collegiate reform in recruiting in this respect. I don't think a college coach should talk to a minor, to any student without their parents being on the line. I want parents to hear what these college coaches are promising to youngsters. So I think this pandemic is a boon for changing, or at least supporting, reform of recruiting, so that we go to a Zoom-based, technology-based evaluation of kids.
I love this, that you're getting on to reforms. The silver lining in this pandemic across many industries is one such thing. So I want to talk about what is that college football is considered the core business of collegiate sports, with basketball running close behind. This week, 60 Minutes reported on the many secondary sports getting axed simply because they don't bring in the dollars. They said that the reality is higher education is operating professional teams with amateur athletes, the first rolling in the money, the second little to show for it. Would you agree? And if in fact we've arrived at this measure that sports is only measured by the bottom line, is there any way around that?
Well, the answer obviously has to be yes. We're on an unsustainable economic track in terms of college sports. But let's start at the very beginning. We never should have brought these teams back. The only reason teams were brought back to campus, and the only reason they're playing now, in my mind, is to recover whatever millions they can from their television contracts. And that's why you're seeing baseball and football, more so than any other sport, brought back, and they're trying desperately to play. And this is sacrificing health for money. And it is a symbol of how a commercialized sport program has corrupted basic ethical decision making in terms of the health and well-being of students. It's a loss of moral compass. And I've said this to my clients, and everybody shakes their head and says, "Oh, we can do it. We can protect kids." The proof of the pudding is out there. They're not able to do it. They're not able to protect kids. And we're not going to see the results of what happens when 17, 18, 19-year-olds get COVID and what the long haul result of that is. We don't know what myocarditis means in terms of this heart inflammation response to COVID. We don't know these things, and we are taking chances with the lives of the next generation of kids. We know there are long-term effects of COVID. So I'm very much disappointed in my professional colleagues who are choosing money over kids' health. But if you ask me in terms of reform, I think within the next year or so, you're going to see some big reforms in intercollegiate athletics. Congress was not happy when SMU told all of their athletes, not only do we want you back on campus to train in the middle of the summer in this pandemic, but we want you to sign this legal liability disclaimer that says if you get COVID, you're not going to hold us responsible. And Congress went a little ballistic with that, and they should have, because it really put the finger on the problem that we're exploiting these youngsters just because we want to bring in some money. So I'm the reform is on the desk of Congress now. We know the NCAA is not going to reform itself. We know that just with their reaction to COVID. And now our challenge is who's going to do it. And I think we're going to see Congress step in. We already have 10 senators who've signed on to a statement of athletes' rights and protections. And they have promised legislation for the next Congress, the 117th Congress that begins in January. I think it'll be released probably before the end of this month. So we'll get a picture of that. But I think they want to address the obligation of schools and colleges for athletic injury insurance, to provide for the full medical expenses that are results of athletic injury. Those are not things that institutions currently are obligated to provide. I think they're going to talk about the time that coaches demand of students. We're looking at students who are spending anywhere from 38 to 50 hours a week on athletics related demands. And that's more than a full-time job, and they've got a full-time course load. There are lots of places that we have to fix in athletics, and finally Congress's attention is focused on it.
Well, COVID has brought in listeners, and that's a very good thing, and awareness, which I know that many of us had no idea. And of particular interest to most of our listeners today, can you talk a little bit about the Huskies, men and women, and are we setting a good example or not? Or do you feel free to talk about that?
Well, there's no question that Division I athletic programs are in need of the greatest reform because they've sold their souls out for the television dollar. So they're the ones who are most likely to suffer poor judgment when it comes to COVID related or economically related decisions. So I've got to group the Huskies in with all other Division I schools who are at high risk for losing their moral compass, and it remains to be seen. Would I like to see the Connecticut women's basketball team win another national championship? Obviously, but if it's not to be this year, it's okay. We know that the NCAA said to athletes last year who were not able to play in the spring, you haven't lost your year of eligibility. We know, for instance, it takes most students 6 years to finish college. So it's not going to kill anybody to take a season off. And I'd rather see, healthy Huskies going on to the WNBA than the alternative.
Thank you. I want to move into the subject of talking about women and the COVID challenge. Before I do, I want to remind our listeners that at about 1 o'clock or toward the end of this program, we'd love to take your questions. So please, just by clicking on the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen, start to get those in, and we'll be talking to you shortly. Dr. Lopiano, you played a major role in defense of Title IX, securing gender equity in athletics. It's now being used as a scapegoat to claim hardship in collegiate sports by its demands for equal numbers. As in so many feminist movements for equality, there's been a severe backlash. Can you please help us understand this crucial issue?
Well, I'd question the severe backlash in this respect, that it was dads who really stuck up for Title IX in the 1970s. And they did so because they found a new point of a relationship with their daughters, that they had something in common, and it was sport. And so many girls became the surrogate sons of their fathers because mom didn't have a chance to play. Right. This was pre-Title IX. Right. And although she might have liked to, she didn't have the chance to play. Now we're in a whole different place where mom has gotten the chance to play. She's coaching her sons and daughters. We're in this brand new place that we've never been before. Enter COVID, and enter basketball and football losing $50 million a year or $100 million a year at the Power 5 schools or the FBS highest NCAA level. And now all of a sudden the athletic directors are doing what? They're cutting a women's swim team to save $1 million when the football team has a budget of $60 million. That is not even smart. And in doing so, they risk the wrath of thousands of alumni who swam at that school, who now will swear that I'm cutting you out of my will. I'm not going to give you another donation. I'm going to keep the name of this university in the newspapers and my letter to the editor for the next 6 months. That schools are taking an unnecessary risk with cutting teams. All we have to do to keep every single men's and women's team during a pandemic or any financial distress is to say to everybody, oh, but we're going to restructure this for the next 2 years, or we're going to restructure this for the next year. And we're not having any travel that's out of our region. We're not traveling nationally. We're not going anywhere on spring break. If we have to move to part-time coaches in terms of assistant coaching staff, that's what we're going to do. We can cut the finances of every sport down, and we can have 3 levels of financial tiering in an athletic program if we have to for any period of time or even permanently, as instead of choosing to cut sports and to suffer the anger of all of these influential alums.
Well, it's interesting because it appears to me that that's a very holistic approach to the sports as a whole, and that would be a welcome change in the future and something that should be incorporated, because there will be other moments in time like this, and we need to have a structure to accommodate it.
No, absolutely. And whenever any institution is suffering, and we go through these periods where we're suffering financially, especially for the next 5 to 10 years, we're looking at lower enrollments because the baby boom is over. All institutions now are going to be facing that financial pressure. So we've got to relook at how we've structured our programs. Maybe we can't treat 15 or 20 sports like kings and queens. Now what we have to do is say, okay, we'll take basketball and football for men. We'll treat them like kings, and then we'll take an equal proportion of women and treat them like queens. And that's probably going to be 4 or 5 women's sports to offset football, right? Right. And then we're going to tier the rest of them, and maybe we're going to give them, instead of 100% of the allowable NCAA scholarships, maybe we're going to give them half of the NCAA scholarships. Maybe we're going to have a bottom tier that's non-scholarship. but we can do all these things within an institution. And right now we're looking at a lot of 6 and 7 figure athletic directors taking the chicken's way out in terms of dropping any men's or women's sports.
And you bring out the kind of reform that we need and the discussions that need to be taking place, which points me in this direction. Women in sports have been unrepresented in leadership roles of sports organizations. That means we're excluded from the decision-making process in the sector, which in turn means fewer women involved in assessing the impact of COVID in sports and issuing the guidelines. Do you agree? And how might that be changed?
Absolutely. You're looking at 80% of all directors of athletics are male, and 90% of those are white male. We have a long way to go in terms of fixing the underrepresentation of persons of color, the underrepresentation of women, and what can you say? This is discrimination that has to be called out. It's the elephant in the middle of the room, and it's schools, predominantly white college presidents hiring people who look like them and who they're comfortable with as their athletic director, and we have to change that hiring process.
True. So before we start with questions, I want to talk just in closing a little bit about sideline strength. You mentioned it in the earlier part of our conversation. We're all in this together. Sports are in our blood as parents, coaches, and fans. Do you have any advice on the considerations a parent might take, or repeat what you might have said at the beginning, to make about when there's a return to school sports?
Well, I'm not sure what you're getting at in terms of the
I think
questions.
you want to be sure that they're testing, because we're hearing now that some teams are going to be called back, and then they're sidelined, and then they're called back.
Sure,
and so,
yeah.
just
I
as
was
a
thinking
parent,
long term forward.
yeah.
We're closed down until January. Most sports in Connecticut
Right.
school sports are closed down until January. Youth sports are closed down. So when that point comes, you're going to have to look at your community and what the community spread is in your town before you bring kids back into the youth sports. Because what have we learned? We've learned that if you live in Enfield, it may be different than if you live in Fairfield County or Bridgeport. So parents have to be on top of that and have to act accordingly. I think in the meantime, if we have the financial resources to do it, we've got to keep these programs whole. So that to the extent that community sport programs are being offered by the YWCAs or the CYOs or the Jewish community centers, or any of these nonprofits or public agencies, if we can help out those businesses, let us do it. Let's encourage them to be on our Zoom calls with our children and to run these practice programs. So don't rush it back. I think one of the things we can do when we come back is to make sure we attend our children's practices, if you're allowing them to go to the park, and we help police separation of kids, because having one coach on the field and a whole bunch of kids on top of each other on the bench or the bleachers, parents are going to have to pitch in and help with disciplining kids in terms of distance from each other. Where's your hand sanitizer? Come over here, get this done.
This is so great, because one of my questions was, what can we do, even fans and parents and all of us, to help support our local athletic organizations, our teams, our kids, the athletic directors? And you just nailed it. We can help by supporting the businesses related to them. We can help by donating, if we can, to these organizations to keep them going. And we can help with the policing of mitigation. So these are all important things, and we can be a part of it while we're going through this difficult time.
For sure.
I read that many students are improving their grades in Lockdown, while many more are falling behind with the lack of planned activities. But that seems to open up unstructured activity, which is maybe equally beneficial. That's one way to look at the bright side, right?
Yeah, and you can't group kids into one, basket. If you're from a middle class or well-to-do household, and you've got plenty of technology and you've got plenty of bandwidth, in your home, um, the sky's the limit in terms of what you can design for your children. If you're in a poorer environment and there is no iPad, there is no cell phone, there aren't any of these things, then we have work to do in our community in terms of making sure that the school is providing and the kids have the bandwidth to deal with the next 6 months, to deal with the basics of education. And just like we're contributing to food banks, I have 2 or 3 devices that, you know, I've kind of thrown in a drawer that now I give locally to my local library or to the Boys and Girls Club and say, hey, who needs this? We all can do that. I'm stunned by how many old iPads are, you know, hanging around a lot of households when they could be used by the next generation of kids who really need it.
That's a very good point. I'd like to go on to some of the questions, and they may seem repetitive, but I think people may have come on a little bit late and didn't get to hear some of what you started with. But one attendant asked, could you speak about the current CDC regulations and restrictions in collegiate sports? And I think you sort of outlined those tiers, but maybe there's just a short update.
No, the collegiate sport's completely different. There is no central control of who is making the decision on what guidelines to follow. Sometimes the athletic conference is doing it. The NCAA is not doing it across the board. So there's an absence of national governance, an absence of a national plan. A conference may do it, but if the conference exists with schools in different states and the rules in each state and the exposure is different in each state, it is a mess out there in terms of colleges and universities. The default always will be, what is the institution? What is the community spread in the community? What's the exposure rate? What does this community tell me we need to do at the college level? That's the safest place to be. And that we shouldn't be traveling across state lines. We shouldn't be engaging in competition if we're in those red zones that we are right now. So I expect to see a shutdown, especially over the holiday break, that this is the time not to take chances. Let's try to shut it down and get back on course by the time most colleges and universities reconvene. So many of our schools closed just before Thanksgiving and now are on break to the end of February, at least colleges and universities. That is really a smart move. And we hope that we take advantage of this and don't blow it while we're home.
Exactly. Now, here's a very important question. While keeping in mind our local COVID risk levels, what's the best way for a freshman sophomore to gain recruiting exposure during COVID, especially since it looks like things may not change for the upcoming school year? The athlete may not have videos to provide the recruiters. For some families, receiving a sports scholarship is the only way they can attend a good four-year university.
Welcome to the era of cell phones. You can take an entire game on your cell phone and you can send it to a college coach. And I don't know of any kid who doesn't have a cell phone or who can't get a friend to keep the cell phone right on the person who is the player who wants the scholarship and follow that kid through an entire game. Our cell phones are better than whatever you can find in terms of a professional video camera.
But if they're not having a game, they just follow them through their solo exercises?
If you're out, let's say you're a basketball player, maybe I'm going to be outdoors and I'm going to put myself through drills outside. I wouldn't even worry about one-on-one. I'd ask about last year's tapes, but I'm not worried about the recruiting part of this. I think we're going to figure out how to play catch up, but I can't say enough about figuring out how to get stuff on video, on cell phones, and sharing it with college coaches.
Be creative. It's amazing. I think that this whole recruitment is a big issue, because another question is, has there been a significant impact for the students who received scholarships or financial support to play collegiate sports who are now unable to play?
The NCAA has adjusted its rules that if COVID results in a team not being able to play their season, that they're not counting that as a year of eligibility, that they are leaving it up to the institution to keep them on scholarship. They're allowing scholarship limits to be exceeded for that reason. So I think the people who are in the poorest position in terms of scholarships are not the new people, but if someone is trying to transfer to an institution after getting started and the institution has already done its recruiting of freshmen, but doesn't have any open places in terms of older players because it's keeping another class on board. Will some kids suffer through this? Probably. But coaches are pretty ingenious too. They're not going to want to lose an entire recruiting class. So, the other thing I would suggest is that most kids who are serious about college scholarships are playing on outside teams apart from their schools. And to get the coach of your outside team to write to the colleges that you're interested in, to talk about you as a player, to share your statistics in outside competition, to be your agent, so to speak, in communicating with with college coaches, that is better than trying to have your dad or mom do it. That if you can try to think who's the objective person, it's probably your travel team coach or your age group coach that probably can do a better job of that.
This has been so enlightening. I'd like to sum it up and tell me if you agree. You've given so much good advice, and it is all basically said to parents, whether you're a parent of a grade school child or a college athlete, and to the athletes themselves: be creative, be assertive, be hopeful, and we can all get through this if we do all of those things. Do you have anything to add?
I've seen some great videos lately of kids who have adapted their indoor workouts because they can't play. There's one going around now of a swimmer who's lying on the in the kitchen, the center
The island.
work table. Yeah, the island in the kitchen, lying on her back, right? Everything from her waist up is off the edge of the island, right? And repeating her stroke. I'm saying to myself, holy cow, my abdominals are shaking just looking at her. But the video of that says to me, I want you to send that to somebody. That says something about your tenacity, about your commitment to the sport, your creativity. We all have that ability. And this generation of kids, more so than us, I think would really be good at this.
So use the technology to your advantage. You talked
Absolutely.
earlier about video games. You talked about the whole family participating. You talked about the woman who put the computer outside and had the exercise classes there for her family. Really we're Zooming. So let's zoom in on sports in exactly the same way we're doing on everything else in our lives, to stay connected and to keep us moving forward.
Hear, hear.
Well, thank you. I'd like to say thank you so much, Dr. Lopiano, for being here today. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you again, and about something so important and clearly something of concern to everyone here in Connecticut and across the country. This is our last webinar for the year 2020. We began this series during the pandemic, and it has proved a useful tool for us and for all our constituency to talk about the issues that are most important to us. So in signing off, I'd like to say we will be back next year with a new schedule of webinars. I'd like to say Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year to all of you. And to remind each and every one of us, wear a mask, socially distance, try not to travel or gather over this holiday season. We can do this. We can do this together. Stay healthy, stay happy, and let's make 2021 the year of well-being. Thank you again, Dr. Lopiano.
You're here. Happy holidays, Geena.
Thank you to all of you who joined us. And once again, be well. Until we meet again.